Great. We're on time today and people are starting to join. Hi, everyone. We're just going to take a few minutes to wait for it to get populated before we start. We're just waiting a few minutes for more people to join. We will probably get started in 2 minutes. Okay, I think we should go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you, Hanin. I'd like to welcome all of you to this week's seminar in the joint series between SOAS and New School. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this topic, money, which is close to my heart and which is obviously important for contemporary economy and society. Now, having said this, the pleasure becomes considerably greater because I'm welcoming Paulo to do the presentation. Paulo dos Santos and I go back a long time. We've known each other for a long time. Paulo is an economist of some standing with considerable technical skills and mathematical background, but he's also a political economist of considerable breadth and depth. Paulo has done significant work in recent years over the macro dynamics of capitalism and the contemporary capitalist economies, looked into profitability, distribution of income, implications for growth, and as I say, the dynamic evolution of capitalism, and all that within a context of political economy, and what are the social implications of these phenomena. Obviously, a significant part of that is the monetary dimension. Capitalism is a monetary economy. Macrodynamics and so on have to do with how money behaves and what happens to the monetary system and to the financial system more broadly, but money in particular. And today's seminar will hopefully cast some light on this, both historically in terms of the long evolution of capitalism, but also more specifically about the contemporary dimension of the money aspects of capitalism, both, again, domestically and internationally. So Paulo is, I can't think of people who are better qualified to do that. So without further ado, Paulo, you've got the floor.
Okay, thank you, Kostas, for that introduction. It's quite humbling. I want to welcome everybody to this conversation and start by just noting explicitly how happy I am to be taking part in this initiative between SOAS and the NSSR, my two professional homes for quite some time now, over 20 years actually. But also a project that I think is particularly important, a project that comes together around the recognition of the need for the development of a contemporary, dynamic, and creative political economy that's trying to grapple with social reality such as it is, not with the capitalism of the heyday of classical political economy, or the capitalism of 100 years ago, or for that matter, the capitalism of the middle of the 20th century, but capitalism such as it exists today. So it's with that in mind that I am particularly delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you, have this conversation about Marx and what he may or may not have said about issues of money, and what that can do for us as we try to grapple with contemporary capitalist monetary systems. Let me start with a disclaimer, or a little bit of an acknowledgement of debts, without laying responsibility for the errors or the controversies that follow. I've been incredibly lucky over the past 20 years. I have studied issues of money, monetary theory, and political economy with people like Charles Goodhart, Kostas Lapavitsas, and Duncan Foley. They all took time and invested in me learning a thing or two. I've always been very humbled and a bit puzzled by that. But there we are. But one of the things when you have great mentors is that it makes you very self-conscious. What is it that you can add on top of what your mentors have taught you? But I think that has focused my thinking a little bit. And I think that I am now ready to share a couple of things with participants in this seminar that I've been thinking about for a while. I still have more questions than answers when it comes to issues of money, Marx, and contemporary capitalism. Those of you who have taken classes with me know that that to me is a good thing. When you have more answers than questions, you're ready to call it a day. But I will say right away that what I will be saying is exegetical. The older I get, the less time I have for more literal or somehow staid readings of Marx. I take Marx's contribution as a legacy that we inherit, a set of tools that we apply to the understanding of the world. If the abstractions that Marx used in a particular context do not give us tools to grapple with the social realities that we're facing, then we need new abstractions. And to me, that's what Marx would do. Not that I care what would Marx say, but that's what Marx would say. With that in mind, and with apologies for what is probably going to be both, I have a talent for this, a somewhat disorganized presentation, but also dense at parts, let me give you 6 or 7 punchlines summarizing what I'm going to try to motivate. First thing is that I would like to throw some caveats to all of you relating to common, if not orthodox, takes on what Marx had to say about money. Money is not a thing, and it's certainly not a thing whose functioning depends on its scarcity. I think we should be pretty confident and ready to recognize that money is some kind of a social convention. I think it's time to drop the commodity fetishism that has for too long kind of cast a cloud over some Marxist thinking of money. And for us to recognize that we may have something distinctive to say, not in refusing to recognize the conventional aspect of money, but by emphasizing the fact that it's a market convention. It's a capitalist convention. And that in many ways makes it a contradiction in terms. It's a deeply contradictory thing. Money, whenever you're talking about it, whenever you're thinking about it, you bump into notions of duality and of internal conflict. And to my mind, that's not a bug, that's a feature of Marxist analysis. The contradiction between the social conventional aspect of money and the private or market or competitive aspect of money actually helps us get to the oomph, to use a technical term, of the recurring monetary instability that plagues capitalism. If you look at the history of monetary systems, if you look at the history of monetary thought, how our thinking has moved over the past, 250 years when it comes to issues of money, all of that is happening against a backdrop of repeated monetary instability and crises. Monetary systems, monetary practices, monetary contracts evolve, there is innovation, and they blow up in crisis. Then both national authorities and private institutions try to address the problem, and monetary theorists try to think about what went wrong and what does it tell us about the nature of this thing. If our monetary theory says that actually money is quite simple and managing monetary systems is not problematic, if only we adhere to one or another maxim, our monetary theory is probably not very good. Monetary theory that does not give us a handle immediately on the fundamental instability of monetary systems is not going to be a very good monetary theory. And that's the kind of statement, by the way, I've come to realize that actually is a criticism of a lot of different traditions. It's the kind of thing I say that makes sure I don't have a lot of friends. This would be a recurring theme in this conversation. Third point, national states are clearly at the center of managing the money convention such as it exists today. That's beyond dispute. But states manage the convention under constraints that are defined by the competitive, self-regarding behavior of wealth holders. Now, that interaction, of course, takes place within an institutional setting that is in itself, if you think about it, shaped by the interactions and relationships between state power and the power of wealth holders, both domestic and foreign. In monetary analysis, politics is going to matter, not as an afterthought, but fundamentally in how systems are managed and what are the class, both internal and external class relationships attendant to the functioning and management of the monetary convention or monetary system. To my mind, this issue, this reality, is clearest in contemporary capitalism when it comes to the question of world money. A question that Marx was distinctive in identifying explicitly, that when we look at the management of international monetary functioning, the settling of international trade, the question that we now call the issue of reserve money, the question of the international monetary regime, we become very clearly aware that there are irreducible matters of politics, of conflict, and of hierarchies that are inherent to the functioning of monetary systems. If our monetary theory doesn't give us a handle on the extractions, on the hierarchies and patterns of subordination that monetary systems define, it's also not going to be a very good monetary theory. To me, monetary theory needs to be a theory that can recognize and give us a handle on instability and on hierarchy and appropriations that are made possible through the functioning of money. In many ways, to me, that's the essence of what Marx was asking us to think about. He had many other things to do with value theory more formally, and I'll get to them in due time. But I think in taking a step back, that's what's proven to be particularly important as capitalism, its credit systems, and its financial systems developed over the past 150 years. I'm not going to go into the issue here in the presentation. We can talk about this later, of international monetary reform today, something that I've been working on for quite some time, but it's totally relevant. And it's particularly to the way in which I've approached this talk and the way in which I've been thinking about issues of money recently. I'll be more than happy to talk about that in the discussion. I would direct colleagues and friends to the article that my great colleague Devika Dutt and I wrote recently, that the Progressive International published last month, with a proposal for a monetary, a multilateral clearing approach to international monetary functioning. Okay, all of that was by way of introduction. I wanted to start the talk proper. I can take a sip of water. By just noting that, for those of us who were lucky enough to bump into people like Kostas 20 years ago, and to be interested in issues of monetary theory and the ontology of money, even when there was only like 5 people interested in all of that. It's just interesting to note that this has become a pretty central issue. All of a sudden, talking about money and what it is cool. This is not something that I was prepared for. I thought that we'd be left alone in our little corner to do our thing, but things changed. Some of it has to do with innovations, cryptocurrencies and debates on whether or not they are money have posed the question of what money is. I think that's a not terribly interesting question because it has a very simple answer. There are also discussions about what are we to make of central bank digital currencies. Another question that I think is not terribly interesting, but it has thrown the issue of money and moneyness into the public sphere. But perhaps most interestingly, to those of us who are engaged with issues of money, has been the fact that we have now for about 15 years or so seen the rise of debates, very prominent and increasingly prominent debates, prompted by the fact that there is a great deal of dissatisfaction against the conventional view in economics that money and monetary systems are best understood as things. And things that function, or that money is a thing that functions primarily in ways defined by its scarcity. Money is an object. And the management of monetary systems is a technocratic exercise in managing the quantities of this thing in ways that are socially neutral. There has been profound unhappiness with this view that for a long time has ruled economic thinking in issues of money. And the interventions that colleagues have made from a number of different traditions and disciplines have actually shaken this presentation of money for the first time, certainly since I've been aware of issues of money. Does it make some sense? We saw this, for example, in last year's Currency and Empire seminar series that we organized at the New School, the Sawyer seminar. There have been, for example, a lot of sociologists and anthropologists and historians that have had a lot of really interesting things to say about the ways in which money and monetary systems have been irreducibly bound up with questions of power and imperial extraction, both in the classical colonial period, but also in present-day capitalism. This has been very, very interesting. Sociologists of money have made a number of interventions now for some time that have forced us also to question this notion that money is an object that requires technocratic management, and urge us to think a little bit more broadly about money as a social convention. All of these interventions are most welcome for those of us working in political economy of money. In economics, the surge in debate has been dominated not so much by post-Keynesian horizontalists who were making points along these lines for some time, since the late 1980s with Basil Moore and others, but the colleagues that have been able to get traction in the public's imagination when it comes to issues of money, of course, are neo-chartalists, colleagues working on the basis of what has become known as modern monetary theory. And I want to say a couple of things there to help motivate the discussion right away. Those colleagues have taken Abba Lerner's functional finance, which is an incredibly important contribution in the Keynesian world about a macro interpretation of what Keynes had to say in the general. The colleagues have taken that and imbued it with a very strong chartalist contention, namely that money is always and everywhere, I'm being very polemical here now, a creature of the state. Money is a legal chartal convention whose circulation is not only supported, but indeed ensured by law or by its standing as legal tender, and by the imposition of tax obligations that can only be discharged by private citizens, private agents, with the production of domestic money. Now, colleagues working on those bases have helped transform fundamentally the conversations that people are having about fiscal deficits, about fiscal policy and monetary policy, certainly in the United States and possibly in Britain. And they have they have, I think, to a very significant extent, popularized the understanding that fiscal and monetary management are irreducibly political exercises and embody political choices. Doing that is extremely important. Nothing that I have to say by way of disagreement or criticism should in any way, shape, or form be taken as a failure to recognize that incredibly important contribution to the conversation. After all, that's what political economy is about. But a lot of us have been left with some measures of theoretical dissatisfaction and sometimes possibly some political unease by some of the contributions. The first one is the notion that money or moneyness is just something that is unproblematically established by the state. One of the problems that some of us have with this, of course, is that obviously no payment obligation, no requirement that I produce a flow of cash of a particular form is going to be 100% effective in ensuring that I hold a given stock of that thing. Certainly not without significant constraints on the movement of capital. I'll get to that in more detail later. There is market functioning that needs to be reckoned with. There is also the question of money holders and their political relationship with the state. We can talk about the capacities of the state, but if we're not problematizing where those capacities of the state come from and how they relate to the interests of wealth holders, we're going to be in a funny place. Abba Lerner was intervening in a very particular period in history, World War II, when the cogency and political capacities of the state were quite exceptional. I'll come back to all of this later on in the discussion, but I wanted to throw that out there just to recognize the contribution, but also make clear that there are some theoretical tensions. Okay. How am I doing for time?
You're doing fine. Just keep at it.
Okay, fine. Okay. If I have, okay. I'll come back to this later, actually. Ask me to come back to this on the discussion. How about that? That's a good trick. We've had all of these discussions coming from sociologists, coming from anthropologists, coming from neo-chartalist colleagues, all helping us understand what's wrong with this kind of fetishistic view of money as a thing and its management as a technocratic exercise. Politicizing the issue, something that's incredibly important. There has been a tendency in some of these discussions to do something that I think is not terribly helpful. Well, two things really. I mean, the first one is and a lot of what I'm going to say is coming from this recognition, that it's not terribly useful for us to be thinking in a dichotomous way about money being either a conventional thing or a market thing, being either a creature of the state or either a creation of the market. I think that's a limiting position, and perhaps the limitations of that are most clearly felt when you bump into some of the discussions that seek to resolve the debate about what is the fundamental essence of money by looking at history. That if somehow we can prove that one thing predated another, we have settled the question of the logic of what money is. that's a common problem when trying to engage with a logical question or a logical debate that people find themselves in, thinking that somehow we can settle it empirically. But it's very much like a chicken and egg thing. You know, people can point to clay tablets with cuneiform inscriptions, giving us evidence that clearly states in Mesopotamia were keeping records of balances that were accruing between people as they traded. We can also see evidence that states were managing that convention, including through periodic jubilees or general forgiveness of debt and so on, for reasons that they found convincing. One of the problems we have, and then people will often draw from that the conclusion that this shows or hints rather strongly that states have always been at the middle of the functioning of monetary systems. The difficulty with drawing that conclusion, of course, is that it's in the very nature of the functioning of organized states to leave records. Atomized trade between potentially foreign small groups of people, happening informally and episodically and mediated by things whose moneyness we would recognize, leaves no record. So the empirical question, this is what the geologists, I'm told, call preservation bias. And it should definitely caution us against thinking that we can settle this question empirically. The other point in this connection that I will share that I came across more recently is that if you think about it, the notion, if you take the chartalist founding myth, the notion that money arises when the state declares that there are obligations that citizens need to meet by producing this money thing that the state then produces to acquire goods and services in markets. That founding parable, we all have founding parables, but the chartalist founding parable actually presumes itself the existence of markets and the existence of market behavior. If I am a state and I want to appropriate labor and the products of labor, why don't I just take it? I mean, I can mobilize a roving horde of horsemen and go and take the stuff if I'm the state. I don't know if this is, so the notion that a state would go about mobilizing social resources by producing something in a market to appropriate it, yes, and then rely on people's willingness to abide by a social norm of producing a token to discharge an obligation, that betrays the pre-existence, I think, of something a lot like market behavior. What I'm trying to motivate here is that when we're thinking about issues of the essence of money and what money is, at some point, I think we need to throw our hands up and simply say, this is fundamentally a dual thing that obviously has state conventional elements, but also is fundamentally something of markets and of market behavior. And I think we can arrive at a synthesis like that with an exegetical, careful and critical reading of Marx that both develops on Marx, but does so by trying to focus on what it was that for him was important to political economy analysis and recognizes the specificities of the historical situation into which he was intervening and the differences between that and our world as it exists today. Cool. I'm going to take a sip of water and I'll go to the meat of the lecture. All of that was to warm up and make sure I lost some friends along the way. And I'm going to start by losing some other friends. Because for everything that I have said, somebody could be forgiven for thinking I'm about to give you a pretty orthodox take on what Marx had to say about money and what's important. And I'm not going to do that. So I'm, like I said, I'm going to lose a couple of friends. There are two sets of difficulties, I think, as we try to grapple with what it is in Marx that can be useful to the understanding of contemporary money. The first thing that's difficult is substantive. I'm sorry, I lost my notes here. The first problem with more orthodox interpretations, more literal interpretations of what Marx had to say, are substantive and relate to a tendency for those to suffer from what you could call a commodity fetishism. The notion that Marx's emphasis on money having a value and that it's functioning in a commodity economy and it's functioning in a capitalist economy is predicated on it having that value means that money must be a commodity. I think that's just wrong. I think that Schumpeter didn't help when he tended to present Marx along lines of that kind. And I think a lot of Marxists, well-intentionally or just not very carefully, have also not helped on that account. We have a reality out there that many people think that when you talk about Marx and money, you're talking about some kind of commodity money. And this problem hasn't gone away, by the way, even if not on, it keeps popping up, even in places that are not exactly or nominally Marxist. And what's the problem with this? That money must be a commodity. Well, the problem is that for over 50 years now, we've lived in a world where there's not even a notional commitment to convertibility anywhere in a system. 50 years now. Even before that, in the Bretton Woods period, convertibility was a very peculiar thing because it was central bank to central bank convertibility, not a commercial transaction animated by individual profit seeking, but a relationship between Cold War allies of the United States and the United States, who was also their guarantor geopolitically. So we haven't really lived under any kind of anything resembling the kind of convertibility we had in the pre-World War I system for a few generations now. And yes, there has been monetary instability, but you know what? There's been less monetary instability in the world now than in the 19th century. One of the things I find least impressive in radical currents in thinking about money is the notion that somehow the post-Bretton Woods system is unstable because it's not anchored on gold. The other version that's not terribly impressive are attempts to show that it is, to my mind, ultimately still being governed, that the monetary system today is still governed somehow. There's gold there somewhere. Maybe it's not gold, maybe it's oil. Or maybe it's natural resources or something. People know what I'm talking about here. I'm sure I don't like mentioning names because I'm too polite, but I don't think that's terribly helpful. Please note that rejecting the notion that there is somehow a commodity anchor underneath the functioning of the contemporary monetary system, rejecting that contention is very different from the important recognition that contemporary central banks have found that the way to manage an unconvertible system with some measure of stability, you still have your regular prices, but day in, day out, they figured that they can manage these systems by regulating the rate of drift in the value of money as defined by a basket of commodities. That is, after all, what inflation targeting and similar nominal anchor regimes are doing. Central banks have come to the conclusion that you don't manage these systems by regulating the scarcity of the money thing. You manage contemporary inconvertible systems by managing the value of the money thing. To my mind and to the mind of others in this call, I'm sure, that is the ultimate triumph of the anti-quantity theory view of things, and in particular of Marx's insistence that draws on Smith ultimately, that there is something that is prior in money, namely its value, that is what regulates the entirety of its functioning, both on the current account or in commercial transactions, and in the capital account or in its store of wealth functioning. It's one of these things where I think that our side has not done a very good job at getting up and having a victory lap and saying, listen, mate, sorted, solved, we won. The other side is so much better at doing victory laps than we are. And that's partly because we're kind of miserable people, I think, fundamentally. Sorry, that was a side comment. Strike that off the record, please, no matter how true I think that is. Our marketing is not very good. There's an aside on this here, by the way, that also about titles and political savvy. The quantity theory has much better branding than we do. They call themselves the quantity theory. In 2 centuries of our tradition, we're still calling ourselves the anti-quantity theory. That's not terribly good from the standpoint of branding. But anyway, that's a separate question. Now I'm going to throw something. So the first reality to grapple with, if you're reaching for this notion that in Marx what we get is the recognition that money must be a commodity in order to function, because it being a commodity means that it has a value, and then it can actually go in there and measure everybody's values and help generate the system of prices. The first problem with that is that obviously we've had inconvertible money for a long time. The second difficulty is more subtle, and is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, ever since Costas kind of set me thinking about this question about 15 years ago, which is this: if money is a produced commodity, then presumably it trades according to not its value, but its price of production. The rate at which it's going to exchange with other goods is going to be governed by its price of production, like every other capitalistically produced commodity. But then if you have that, then money prices are going to hinge on the relative composition of capital in the production of the monetary commodity. And it's going to hinge in ways that ensure that changes in the functional distribution of income change the ratios. People with me here? So not so simple, at least not without some major qualifications. The final thing that I think is worth thinking about here in terms of the conventionally accepted or orthodox take on Marx and money is something that Wicksell pointed to, and I think rather persuasively. These are not Wicksel's words, but Wicksell read everybody, Walras, Menger, Jevons, and he read Marx. And he understood Marx. And Wicksell says, listen, even if we can identify a well-defined production cost for a monetary commodity, and even if we accept that Smith was right and Marx was right, and that production cost is, but via arbitrage, something that regulates the overall volumes of money in circulation in ways that enforce those production costs upon the value of money, the rhythms or frequencies or time lapses over which such arbitrage taking would affect the system are overwhelmingly likely to be far lower frequency, much longer periods of time than the time windows over which developments in liquidity management, those are not his words, but basically the developments in liquidity management and developments in the balance of payments change the flows of money looking for goods as aggregate demand, changing the value of money. So at the very least, I think Wicksell was saying one needs to have a more well-articulated, dynamic characterization of these different regulations on the value of money. And I think that's interesting. The other set of difficulties in trying to identify what's useful with what Marx had to say about money have to do with Marx's place in the history of economic thought. And that's in part because Marx very, very deliberately placed himself as a proponent of a particular line of thought. He very much positioned himself as, certainly within the ambit of the banking school, and in particular took. You look at what Marx had to say about money, and he draws a line from Smith through Took to himself. It's a tradition that rejects the quantity theory. It's a tradition that rejects Say's law. And when somebody does that, sometimes it becomes difficult to pin down what it is that they're saying that's new, right? What is there in Marx that is not in Took is a question that the one can raise. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Sorry, just to take a step back before saying this. The point I was trying to make about the basis upon which money comes to have a value, and that value regulates quantities of money, and how that helps define the social relations contained within systems of prices, is that things are more complicated than the conventional orthodox Marxist take that labor has, that money, the monetary, that money functions because it's a commodity, and that commodity has a clear labor cost that we can anchor the entire system of prices upon, ultimately. I increasingly find myself thinking of Henry Thornton instead, who actually recognized that even in a convertible system, contemporary monetary systems require management by a state institution, and the management of that institution faces irreducibly political trade-offs that have to do with the domestic functional distribution of income, the preservation or destruction of domestic production capacities, and with the strains that what we could call a national payments community faces from its interconnections with other payments communities elsewhere in the world. Those of you who have heard me lecture before know that in addition to being disorganized, I have terrible narrative tension because I just gave the game away here. That's in many ways my punchline. But Henry Thornton was compelling, and in many ways anticipated a lot of the things that we're still grappling with. He had a bad habit, by the way, of being keenly aware of the disequilibrium nature of things. And when you are a thinker like that and you don't write very clearly, 3 people read you, and David Ricardo eats your lunch, and then everybody forgets about you. That's a general rule of the history of thought, by the way, that I'm proposing. Happened a little bit to Malthus as well with his contributions of rejecting Say's law, but that's outside of our remit. Okay. The other problem that Marx has is this. Marx is writing what? Really in that middle chunk of the 19th century. He's living in a world that has manifestly, certainly in Europe, convertible monetary systems. And you have a pretty, certainly in relation to today, relatively early levels of credit system development and of financial system development. So even, I'm trying to, so even though he engaged very interestingly with the things that were developing in his world in terms of credit instruments, in terms of credit monetary forms, and I'll say a few things really by way of presenting things that Costas has articulated 20 years ago. Marx had many things to say about the endogenous and spontaneous evolution of what he called money substitutes in credit markets and the instabilities arising therein and so on. And he had many things to say about what we now call the corporation and the kinds of social relations that the corporate form establishes and the tensions that it creates and so on. He was looking at very early credit and financial systems. People like Hicks, people like Keynes, people like Minsky had an advantage coming, 80, 90, 100 years later, of being able to look at these systems after they achieved a certain maturity and were able to say things that, to my mind, are in many ways Marxist in thrust, but on the basis of contemporary relations that we can more readily recognize as our own. That creates certain difficulties in trying to identify what is it in Marx that is helpful today. Certainly, if one wants to adopt a very kind of individualist reductionist, my tribe is better than your tribe view of things. To my mind, one of the most prominent Marxist economists of the 20th century was Minsky. Stability is destabilizing is one of the most Hegelian Marxist things anybody has ever said in economic analysis. He understood that part of what Marx wanted to get at were these endogenous, pathological, and unavoidable tendencies towards disruption that a decentralized economy consisting of interdependent agents suffers from, right? So it becomes difficult to try to pin down what it is that Marx had to say that is particular that we can identify in him that's particularly helpful in trying to understand the world today. With all of those caveats, here's what I think is important. Here's what I think that we can go back to Marx and read, and with an open mind, actually come out of it better equipped in trying to understand the world today such as it is. And I have a list. I like lists because they help me keep organized. If I can find my notes. These are what I think the most interesting elements in Marx that can be exegetically developed in ways that can help us understand the world today. The first one is this. For Marx, money is not an afterthought. Money is something that is fundamental to the functioning of capitalist economies. It's going to be at the center of any processes that we can understand to lead to the emergence of a value system in a decentralized market economy. Money is also at the center of the social relations of capitalism. Money is the first thing that Marx engages in the opening 3 chapters of Capital with his discussion of the value forms. And I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. It's also central to what we should understand as the totality of what Capital says capital is. A set of social processes, practices, conventions, and institutions that enable the reproduction of a distinctive form of social power. And that social power takes the form of money, giving the bearer unconditional command over social labor and its products. For Marx, money is at the heart of that, the basic cell of capitalism, the commodity, and it's at the center of the process that dictates, that sets that organizing impetus for of capitalist reproduction. You see echoes of this, not so incidentally, for example, in Minsky's discussion of modern industrial economies involving enterprises doing position taking, as he calls it, in long-term capital assets, and the coordination for undertaking in those are monetary and financial contracts that are struck between competing parties, and trying to locate in the problems or potential malfunctioning in those contracts one of the sources of pathological instability in the functioning of capitalist economies. So that's interesting. Marx also thought that money can function because it is a measure of value, and that's important. Value as it emerges from competitive processes of factor mobility. Value systems arise from competitive movement of labor and capital within, as I will emphasize, national political economies in ways that tend to create uniformity and generality in the rates of return that those factors receive. Money is a measure of that value that emerges from those processes. It's a universal equivalent, something that is, according to Marx, inherent to commodity exchange, and it's simultaneously the characteristic form of social power under capitalism. Under capitalism, social power doesn't come from land ownership, doesn't come from occupying a particular place in a religious hierarchy. Social power doesn't come from being part of a roving band of horsemen that take things. Social power is money. Social power is possession of a thing that then impels other human beings to do things for you, including giving you the things that they've produced. In all of those discussions of Marx, and if you didn't see it the first time, take a closer read next time. You'd be amazed by how much Marx learned since the last time you read him. In all of those discussions, the money thing is clearly a social thing. And I'll get into that in a second. It's also true that in all of those discussions, that the money thing is also a social thing that needs to act in certain ways. It needs to act in certain ways in markets that are populated by self-regarding agents. There is a tension in Marx's work throughout, in all of his discussions about money, between money's conventional nature and its market nature. And that tension is crucial. It ensures that money is a characteristically capitalist convention in a way that Michael Kalecki would recognize when he says, capitalists do many things as a class, but they don't invest as a class. They also don't bestow or recognize in a continuous fashion moneyness in a particular convention in any situation where it's not going to be individually advantageous to them. Money is a convention, but it's a capitalist convention. And what is capitalism, if not the upending of any social convention that runs counter to private interest? That is fundamentally present, I think, in Marx's discussions of money, both early in Capital One and later in Money as Social Power or Money as Capital. Next point that is important. Money is not what money does, or put differently, what money is not defined by what it does. For a particular convention to function as money, it must do what a commodity economy or what a capitalist economy requires it to do. And a key point here is that any given money convention may not always and everywhere be able to do that. Monetary instability and dramatic changes in the capacity of certain conventions to function as money, all of that is inherent and recurring in the history of capitalist monetary systems. That is as permanent, as inherent as a feature in money, as is the continuous evolution in the different forms that are taken by the monetary convention, and the continuous evolution in the nature of monetary systems. I think anybody who has gone back and tried to become familiar with the history of monetary systems over the past 200 years, that's one of the first things that jumps at you. The system is always changing. Again, I'm going to be provocative here. There has been a tussle between states and private agents producing different forms of shadow money for over 200 years. And invariably, these incipient forms of unorthodox money both do something for the system, but create crises. And it blows up. And then you have a debate. And then maybe you regulate it so as
Paulo, you've gone mute. You've gone mute.
How about now? Can you hear me?
That's better.
All right. So this competitive interaction between innovations and markets in terms of monetary forms, provocatively, we can call them shadow money, and states goes back a long, long time. Recurring instability and evolution is central to what money is and what monetary systems are. Money is not defined by what it does. Marx is not terribly concerned with the practical origins of money. He does say things about it, but to me, it always came across as a bit of an afterthought. Oh yeah, by the way, the things to which portability, people know the discussion I'm referring to when he's talking about metals and the emergence of money. And I think that's not accidental, because he is more concerned with the logical and social content of the monetary convention than he is with the particular practical form that can, over some period of time, be the means to perform those things. Okay, two key substantive things in Marx that I want to dwell on a little bit more. And here I'm drawing on Costas's paper on money as the monopolist of the ability to buy, or general equivalent, and contributions from the Japanese Uno school, and in the development of a distinctive reading of the value form discussion in Capital. Marx wanted to show that money is something that is inherent to the commodity form. Now, whether or not he was successful in the discussion in the opening pages of Capital, that's subject for discussion. I found those early on when I was first reading Capital to be incredibly irritating discussions, very difficult. I found them because he wasn't defining the terms. He starts talking about, before he even talks about linen and coats, and I grew up in Latin America. I didn't know what linen and coats were. But then he throws out this term, the relative and the equivalent, and there's no definition. It took me decades before I realized, oh, equivalent, equal value. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? He was trying, I think, and I think Costas and I, we had recently a back and forth in this. Costas has a more developed version of this. Marx was trying to provide a logical argument that it is inherent to the commodity form for there to be a money form associated with the functioning of a monetary of a commodity economy. And that is because there is in the commodity form a fundamental distinction between what we more conventionally call buying and selling. That when we are selling something, we're doing something fundamentally different than simply taking the other side of a purchase. That when we're selling something in a commodity economy, we are looking for elements of social sanction for our private productive effort. And that moneyness then is to be found in the convention on which individual commodity producers find it worth their while to seek this measure of social sanction for their productive effort. The universal equivalence, equivalence, equal value. Whereas when you're buying, you're just looking for the exchange, for the value in use, for the use value. So I find that interpretation is particularly convincing and important because it emphasizes the fact that in daily market exchanges, even when a particular monetary convention holds sway for quite some time, it holds sway only in as much as these private atomized agents are finding it in their interest to continue to seek the social sanction for their private productive effort in that particular convention. And if you don't believe me, read about episodes of fundamental monetary crises when these things become very evident. There is a side note here about those of us who had the fortune/misfortune of coming of age in places with a great deal of macroeconomic and monetary instability, being kind of hardwired to expect the thing to fall apart, which imposes a certain discipline in thinking about these issues. Answers to the problem of money that present themselves as kind of facile, or as, hey, money is just this, it's easy to manage it. That doesn't seem very persuasive. So I think that's important. The other element, important element in thinking about this then, if the essence of moneyness in commodity exchange is in this continuously reproduced want of private agents to seek social sanction in a particular social convention, then the real problem is for us to seek, as Costas put it in his 2003 book, the social foundations for the constitution of a particular reliance of a convention as the means of social sanction for private productive efforts. And when you look at the history of monetary systems, you realize that different monetary conventions have sustained that in different ways, and by relying on different social processes with different social content. And that's important. Our monetary theories need to be able to grapple with that. Second thing that is important, and the second kind of central role that money plays for Marx, as I said, it's not in commodity exchange, but it's in money as capital, as the characteristically capitalist form of social power. If money is the universal equivalent for as long as a certain set of social conventions hold. The bearer has the capacity to approach markets anonymously and command social labor. Capital as a whole for Marx is actually a set of social relations, practices, and institutions that allow some agents to reproduce that power. And it's a process that starts with money and finishes with money. That, not so incidentally, gives us another route back to the value form discussion. If we realize that if you're not talking about the commodity economy abstraction of Marx, but if you're talking about capitalist economies, sellers are capitalist enterprises. So that search for the social validation or social sanction of the private productive effort is the realization of profits based upon the extraction of surplus value. So this element of the reproduction of social power, that is the guiding purpose of the circuit of capital as a whole, and this element of universal equivalence are deeply intertwined. Of course, Marx was living in the mid-19th century, so he could not see how that panned out as financial systems developed. Here's where people like Hicks, for example, I find particularly useful. Hicks recognizes that, look, just like we can recognize that money has a very particular role in exchange, we need to recognize that the money thing in capital markets also performs a very particular thing. It's the most general store of wealth. Money in wealth portfolios, Hicks says, is the thing that people feel so safe about that it's the thing into which they park their wealth as they're making bearish bets on the movement of asset prices. In other words, a speculative motive. And when you're thinking about this, Hicks says, you have to be aware that the thing that acts as money in capitals, that's a fleeting thing too that is subject to competition. If private agents are not satisfied with a thing in portfolios that was money yesterday, but they don't think that it's money today, they are going to come up with substitutes. They may be domestic substitutes, they may be foreign substitutes, but the system is going to demand, and there's going to be money to be made by meeting that demand for an alternative, safe store of wealth. This is in his opening two essays, the two triads, and available in his book, Market Theory of Money, which I find to be very much in line with this understanding of the search for stores of wealth, contemporary financial systems offering capital a variety of different ways in which wealth can be stored, but in the recurring possibility of a collapse of particular forms of storing a value that are characteristic of capitalism. Let me speed up because I'm running out of time. I have points.
I am acutely aware that
Okay.
I'm fascinated by this, you can imagine. But,
I can continue, but I'm just going to say one more thing. Look, I think that all of that said, the most distinctive and helpful thing that Marx taught us about money was his explicit recognition that international monetary functioning is distinct from domestic monetary functioning. Marx's critique of capitalism, Marx's critique of political economy, if you want to get a bit cute, but maybe not too cute, if you just want to bottom line it, arises from a recognition that a competitive capitalist economy creates an irreducibly interdependent world. Production becomes social, but the organization of production and appropriation is individual. There is a gap in levels of determination that recurrently creates problems. One of the places where this appears, and this became clearer to Marxists after Marx's death, involves the nation state. The fact that capitalist political economies are fundamentally national in scope. They are built upon national labor markets, in many instances, national capital markets, and national institutions, including monetary systems, that can ensure that those economies reproduce themselves with reasonable measures of social and economic stability in ways that are conducive to the creation and appropriation of surplus value. But those national economies are interdependent. And they're interdependent by a variety of different ways and in ways that are different across time. The problem of world money is a problem of that mismatch between the national nature of capitalisms and the international interconnections between those economies. For Marx, world money was inherently problematic, for most broadly for the reason that I just said, and poses a series of questions that I think need to be tackled. The key thing to recognize is that, and this is something that David Ricardo already recognized, although he went in the direction of the price-specie flow mechanism and the notion that somehow the international system and national systems bring themselves into harmony spontaneously, is that it's very difficult for you to posit that the labor theory of value is going to tell us very much about what regulates international trade, and if it's going to give us anything resembling the notion of value that we use when thinking about national economies. And that's because in international transactions, you don't have typically the levels of mobility of capital, and certainly the levels of mobility of labor, upon which value systems are predicated. The emergence of value systems is predicated. So there are different principles, probably, governing international trade and finance. What are those principles? Well, the best guess that we can, looking at history and the fact that across different historical moments, there are different measures of mobility of labor, different measures of mobility of capital, different levels of commercial and productive interdependencies across economies, and so on, is that specific international monetary regimes fundamentally determine what are the things that govern patterns of trade and the social and investment and the social relations that they define. There is a level of historical specificity that you find across the different international monetary regimes that capitalism has experienced that give us a different setup, a different set of typical outcomes that you get as a result of the regulation of trade and capital flows between national economies and what that means for domestic class relations. We all know that the gold standard, for example, had anti-debtor, pro-creditor biases, and that the mechanism for adjustment was the domestic real wage. So you had gut-wrenching recessionary adjustment processes that impose costs on the working class of deficit countries. We know that the move to inconvertible systems with measures of exchange rate stability eased that a little bit, but not arbitrarily so. We have lived in worlds that have a great deal of capital mobility, but labor, very significant restrictions on labor mobility. So it does mean that devaluations can actually reduce domestic wages, certainly in terms of international measures. But that is not a winning strategy for closing chronic balance of trade and balance of payments problems. All of this requires concrete analysis. And the most interesting question to me from that recognition then is there anything that one can do based on the recognition that for some time now, the world economy is going to consist of national political economies that are interdependent by trade, by capital flows, perhaps by some measures of immigration, perhaps by some measures of integration of production. Is there anything that we can do in thinking about the design of the international monetary system that can help it no longer be a locus of regular disruption and of systematic expropriations and transfer from the weak to the powerful? Because that's been really the theme of pretty much every single arrangement that we have had for mediating international monetary relations. This is something about which Keynes had some interesting things to say, and that now with the new Brazilian government coming to power and starting to articulate some of these things in the international arena is going to be a topic of conversation. I think that if our insights coming from what Marx had to say about money and its social content can be brought to bear in informing those discussions, we'll be doing pretty well for ourselves, even if we haven't solved all of the questions. And I can talk about the relationship between that and other political projects inspired on Marxist lines, but that in itself is something that requires attention. Obviously, this went for a lot longer than I thought, for a change. But I hope that it wasn't too disorganized and that there's a discussion that allows us to fix all of this. This is going to be recorded as well, right? And it's going to be available, so you also may find that I become less incoherent the second time around. Even I find that sometimes. So I'm going to stop and hand it over to my distinguished hosts to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. This was definitely wide-ranging and very keenly delivered, as expected. You've certainly opened up a lot of issues, and you went deeply, very deeply in several respects and very broadly in others. So I think all of us have got something to chew and to think about. And to help us along, we've got two discussants, both of whom particularly interesting regarding the work they're doing on money and finance. One is Hanin, the other is Josephine. They will open up further the discussion by coming up with particular points, comments, and so on, and raising further issues. Given the time, however, I would ask them to be sharp and to the point, to give us at least half an hour for discussion. So, without further ado, please, Hanin, and then Josephine.
Josie, go ahead. Josie's going to start.
Okay, let's do it the other way. Yeah.
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. I do have a presentation, so just let me pull that up. Cool. Hopefully everyone can see that. Hi, my name is Josephine Baker, as you just heard, and yes, I'm a PhD student at the New School, and my research doesn't actually primarily address the topic of money, but I spent the last 2 years on the Currency and Empire team working with a bunch of amazing scholars, including Paulo, and I like to think that I learned something from those 2 years. So yeah, and I will try my best to be brief. Oh, sorry. So the place that I want to start is with the idea of rejecting universal definitions of money. And a lot of this is inspired by the work of Andrew Edwards. So I want to give credit where credit is due. And I just want to talk about how the way that we define money expresses the historical, social, and political context of our theoretical frameworks, and the limits that we impose on our definitions of money also limit our frameworks. And counter to this, I would say we need to historicize and politicize not only monies, but monetary theory. And this gets at, for me, Stephen Eich's The Currency of Politics, in which he argues for pluralism in monetary theory, and specifically says that allowing for this pluralist view means letting go of origin stories. And his argument here is that we need to repoliticize money and situate monetary theory in moments of crisis. So I'll get to that a bit more. The one definition of money that I think it is okay to accept, because it feels pretty clear and self-evident, is money as a social relation. I just have 2 quick quotes here, but for the sake of brevity, I won't go into this too much. Just getting at sort of the logic of money, this slide is basically just supposed to be about the typical critique of neoliberal economic theory on the basis of its attempts to depoliticize and naturalize economic theory. And this is basically just saying that the same thing applies for monetary theory. Essentially, of course, money is not a neutral veil. None of this is particularly new. I've listed some books and works here that get at this same point. So the thing I do want to get at is the idea of unsettling money or unsettling the ideas of money. In unsettled moments are horizons of the teleological and ontological possibilities of money.
I think we've lost.
And bring our attention to. Oh.
We okay. We seem to have connection again. I seem to have lost connection for a bit.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was just saying these moments of contestation make us reconsider monetary possibility while bringing our attention to the fallibility and questionability of these entities. Let me just note that an unsettled and pluralist view does not negate our ability to understand the limits of money and monetary policy. If money is a power relation, power relations can impose limits. So this gets at, for me, Marx through the eyes of Ike, and by contrast, through the eyes of de Bruynhoff. Ike in his work is focused on situating monetary theories in unsettled times and relating these theories to the potential teleology of money in political contestation. Ike's accounting of Marx's monetary theory traces the evolution of Marx's thinking, specifically regarding credit and French utopian monetary theory. Ultimately, Ike concludes that Marx foreclosed the possibility of money as a site of political contestation, and that us contemporary Marxists also do that. On the other hand, I think that de Bruynhoff's summary of the social element, or the social reading of Marx's theory of money, is a much more unsettled and contested view. And she relates this back to hoarding, and specifically hoarding in terms of both state and individual power. So I think that she sort of exposes both a simultaneously unsettled view and one that acknowledges the limits of money. Sorry, I'm trying to be fast here. Okay, illogics of money or gaps in the system. To unsettle money, we don't need specifically times of like extreme crisis. We can look for small gaps in monetary systems and even come to question the systemic nature of money to begin with. If we look for gaps, we can potentially come to understand money as simultaneously pervasive and powerful, as well as fallible, illogical, and eclectic, and maybe even at times ironic or comical. Thus, the empirical side of this presentation looks at specific gaps in the monetary system. And I'm sorry, yes, one of my examples is crypto. The first one being crypto. I'm obviously not going to tell you whether money, or get into the debate of whether money is or is not crypto. My personal take is that the truth is that currently the viability of private monies in general is not only still up for debate, but it's still up for determination. Even if we pick a sort of settled side of whether crypto is or is not money, if crypto isn't money, then crypto exposes a gap in the general monetary system. We see this with Bitcoin filling the gap needed for the functioning of Silk Road, the online black market platform. The second option, though, is that crypto is money and has gaps in its own inconsistencies and gaps. And I'm going to talk briefly about those inconsistencies and gaps here. So to begin with, crypto has always been a political idea, or has always been backed and intertwined with a political ideology. This can be seen very clearly in Timothy May's Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. And then also, because it wouldn't be a presentation by me if I didn't mention Hayek, some trace its ideological roots back to Hayek's denationalization of money. Ike argues that crypto tries to present a depolitical front. I'm not entirely sure that this is, at least in the early days, very true, but in its current form, which espouses a very liberal ideology, I can see why it might seem that way. And some of the goals of crypto, sort of the decentralized management, privacy, et cetera, these very liberal things. Sorry, it's not going to my next slide. Oh. Okay, but the ontology and teleology of crypto doesn't live up to its ideals. I think that this paper I've cited, Filippi and Lovelock, shows this very well. They talk about the governance structure of Bitcoin and how it's inherently inconsistent with the ideology of crypto. In addition to this, I've put in some quotes from one from Cory Doctorow, who's sort of a post cypherpunk who is criticizing crypto, and then the other one from Jackson Palmer, who was one of the co-founders of Dogecoin, which, speaking of Dogecoin is itself is one of the examples of how illogical crypto can be, in the sense that it was literally created as a joke. Okay, the second example that I want to get at is the Bank Restriction Act and this piece of art, the Bank Restriction Note. This example is explicitly from Max Haven's Revenge Capitalism. Yeah, so the bank restriction period, I think we all know what it is, and I don't need to go back over that. But at the time, the Bank of England, I'll just note, was issuing a lot of new money and a lot of new pound notes. And specifically, they had decreased in quality and increased in volume, which meant that forgery and counterfeiting of these notes became incredibly easy to do. And so many people did. And this is sort of mocked in this bottom right corner. The Bank of Engraving is a fake note making a joke about the fact that engravers so frequently forged these notes. So counterfeiting is ultimately also a political act. And we can see that through both these sort of satirical mockeries of counterfeiting that they themselves look like notes. But we can also see this there are multiple examples in terms of war with counterfeiting being used both in the American Revolutionary War and World War II as a war tactic rather than as a actual means of forgery. Okay, when people were punished for this type of forgery in these times, there was the bank enacted like particularly harsh forms of punishment that were legal but had not always been enacted, and these included death, but then also transportation. And when people were sentenced to transportation, this meant being shipped off. One thing that their families would often do would be to create love tokens, and love tokens are created out of coins and are sort of a debasement of that currency for the sake of engraving them with sentimental messages. Thus, as Haven describes, love tokens represented proletarians taking money back into their own hands. And so in this sense, they are a form of both resistance and somewhat ironic as well. Yeah, so basically that's the end of the presentation. I think what I'd like to leave you with is the idea that money and monetary systems are, of course, inherently political, fallible, and imperfect. And at one time, they're tremendously powerful and often serve to support capital and subordinate the working class, yet they are also imperfect and limited. To end with a few questions, maybe we can ask if we can ever escape money as a distinctly capitalist form of social power, and if money and monetary policy are viable sites of political contestation. Great, hopefully that was fast enough for everyone, and yeah.
Thanks, Josie. I'll jump in. I also had a presentation that was going to take about 10 to 12 minutes, but I think I'm only going to give you or try to give you the thesis. I will still need my slides to do that, but I'm just going to basically walk you through it very quickly and just take you to the punchline. Because we have many questions. I have many questions for Paulo. So I'm going to be super brief. I've been studying digital currencies, and I'm not going to get into the ideology of them. I'm not going to get into whether they're money or not. My position, we don't know. If something is money, we won't be asking if it's money. So we don't know. We don't know what's going on. So at this point, I'm just curious. I'm just curious because I want to understand if it's going to have any impact on the international monetary architecture. Is this not moving? Okay, context. Dollar reserves are going down. Gold purchase is up. And are we going to move into some sort of a multipolarity? Multipolarity is at the center of what I am thinking about. And this is redundant, so let me skip. So I was going to give you some theoretical backdrop, types of money, then go into crypto and stable coins, and then into central bank digital currencies, and then conclude. We don't have a lot of time, so let me just say a few things. I am building exactly on what Paulo has said. Theoretically, exactly, and on the same scholars that he mentioned, including himself. So Lapavitsas, Foley, and Paulo as well, along with many others. I will only make a few comments here. So in the emergence of the universal equivalent, for me, institutions were there from the beginning. And I'm not talking about institutions as we know them today, institutions in general. Economic, social, and legal. That's one. Two, there's no reason for us to assume that the period of shifts between those forms, as Kostas Lapavitsas puts them, was short or peaceful. Also, we don't have to assume that once we reach the final stage of the universal equivalent, that that stage will be permanent, or that that arrangement, meaning that world money at the top, will be permanent. Okay, so those are the two important points, and let me move away from here. Why am I talking about central bank digital currencies and crypto? This chart shows us that when we look at money, we look at either inside money that is now created by commercial banks, or outside money that is basically central bank money, the cash. Okay, this is a mistake. This is cash. Anyway. CBDC, central bank digital currencies, are just a replication of cash, but it's digital. And Bitcoin is trying to be a new outside money. Stable coins that are backing themselves one-to-one with the dollar, in almost 90% of the cases, want to be a new form of inside money. This is important because I'm going to make the case that those fintechs are trying to compete with commercial banks over who's going to issue inside money, or we're going to start seeing new players in this inside money creation process. Okay, market capitalization, even though it's not necessarily super significant, it's still high of the cryptocurrency. It was almost at 3 trillion at the end of 2021, and now it's a bit under 1 trillion. I have data to tell you that adoption is increasing, and it's especially increasing in upper middle income countries and in lower middle income countries. And it's very interesting because we start to see that it's increasing in countries that have unstable or problematic currencies. And this is a chart that shows a group of countries, but I will only highlight two, and that is Turkey and Argentina. And in 2022, when individuals were asked of ownership of cryptocurrencies, it was up to 40% of people in Turkey that answered yes, and up to 35% of people in Argentina that answered more, which is very interesting and significant. This slide is important, but I can't spend time on it. I just want to highlight one thing. As users, eventually, when we are moving into cryptocurrencies, we are moving into it through multiple layers to the point we are so far removed from the base that is a blockchain that we might not even be aware that we are moving into a cryptocurrency. We are just using applications that make our life easier. And those applications will be built on blockchains and coins that themselves move us into this space, again, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Central bank digital currencies. Again, all of this, and I'm thinking, why is this interesting? Why is this important? Central bank digital currencies, let me skip this. Over 60 countries are looking into introducing central bank digital currency, and this is a map to show you the phases that different countries are in. The green is research, the purple is proof of concept, and the orange is pilot. I'll highlight a couple of things here. while the US is kind of relaxed about introducing a central bank digital currency, a country like Canada is not at all, because they are concerned about dollarization, ironically. Many other important things here to highlight, but I will skip. Another very important piece of information to think about while you are trying to think about why are central banks thinking about introducing a central bank digital currency, and how is a CBDC any different from what they do now? Money is already digital. The BIS are working on many projects. I'll highlight 4. All 4 are trying to move money across border without using, 1, intermediaries or correspondent banks, and without using the dollar. The first project has Hong Kong, Thailand, China, and United Arab Emirates in it. The second one has France and Switzerland in it. The third one has Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Africa in it. And the fourth one has Italy, Singapore, Malaysia, and some payment providers. This is to say that different currencies, so we're not only seeing clusters of countries within Europe trying to move the euro to each other. We're talking about different currencies trying to move across border without intermediation and without the dollar. So again, what does this mean? To understand this, I try to frame this in a way that is more manageable. I apologize for this typo. So I think of competition that is emerging in 3 different types. Competition that is emerging between the private and the private, and competition that is emerging between the public and the public, and then one that is emerging also between the private and the public. And this is to go back to Paulo's point when he was saying that there is a difference between sovereign money and international money. This private and public will take place within a country's border, but it will also take place internationally, and it will look very different. So let me just say a few things about each point and wrap up. So the private and the private means big tech are moving into the money creation space. They are competing with central banks. And stable coins will only be taken seriously if they get regulated. And they are lobbying very, very strongly to get regulated and start to have reserve accounts with the Fed, FYI. So when or if those entities get regulated and they start to introduce their own money, those techs are not calling their money the dollar, just like commercial banks are. Commercial banks call their money, the money that they create, the dollar, and they use that unit of account. Those entities are not calling their money the dollar, and they are not using that as a unit of account. So we will start to see a new form of money that could potentially even go a step further in how it starts to split its functions, split how money functions, meaning I save using one thing and I buy using another, and I transact in this space, let's say medical space, using this coin, but I transact in food and beverage space using a different coin. Okay, so that's the first form. The second one is the public and the public. And now we're seeing central banks introducing those currency. And the one thing that I keep going to is that they want to be relevant. Commercial central banks, by introducing a CBDC, they're not really doing anything different, but it is a way to start this conversation. It is a way to start to build a system that is not centered around the dollars. And with the private, I think I can skip this one and take you to my last slide. So again, central banks, what are they doing? They're trying to be relevant. They're trying to remain relevant, especially after Facebook tried to introduce their Libra currency, which was going to be a new unit of account, cross-border, overnight, with 2 billion users. It is a way of showing discontent with the current system and try to look into ways of disrupting it. And maybe this will lead us to getting to a point where we have multiple monies at the top of the hierarchy instead of the world money arrangement that we have now, maybe. And this is significant for private monies, again, because technologies will disrupt the ownership of the money creation. But then here, it's very important to keep in mind that this will be cross-border in a way that the private money that banks issue today is not, because those entities by design are cross-border. I mean, they could be over a certain region or they could be global. And this could start to introduce issues of currency substitution in ways that are new, because they are not currency substitution on a firm scale or on large investor scale. They're currency substitution on household scale and small usage scale, but could be large in number. And having said that, I'm going to stop and take us to the Q&A. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's take the questions then, and let's open up the discussion in the remaining time. There's a lot to discuss.
Yes, yes. Okay, so the first question is from Raphael, and Raphael is saying, is the American dollar as a world gold standard at stake nowadays? With the general geopolitical turmoil going on lately, USA, Russia, China, Europe, etc., is it making it more difficult for the USA to refinance its commercial debt? Paulo, you're muted.
Okay, no. In some ways, yes, and then in many ways, no. The dollar is very much at the center of the current international monetary system. Rama Vasudevan made an important observation concerning the 19th century gold standard, certainly towards the end of the 19th century, that it was in fact anchored on a sterling system, that settlements were taking place nominally in gold, but these were all transactions taking place in London banks. So in many ways, the current dollar system is reminiscent of the gold system, but not because there's gold, but just because there is a national currency at the heart of it. And that does bestow a number of privileges on that particular political economy, as European commentators were pointing out since the middle of the last century. I don't think any of the tensions such as they exist today are creating difficulties for the United States to manage its external position. In fact, the United States still very much enjoys this privilege where management of its balance of payments is easier than anybody else's. There is an important point implicit in the question that I want to emphasize. One of the most compelling arguments for a process of international monetary reform that is genuinely multilateral, that is pursued in line with the broad outlines of Keynes's Bancor and ICU proposals of the early 1940s. The most compelling argument, or one of them, is that route would allow us to address this outstanding question of capitalist economic development without it getting caught up in rivalries between different would-be monetary hegemons. The move from sterling to dollar took place between two great powers that in the end fought two wars on the same side. That was not a given for anybody that has a more sophisticated understanding of history. But it did get caught up in a great deal of rivalry between the United States and Britain. A great book on that, by the way, is Liaquat Ahmed's The Lords of Finance, charting everything that the US Treasury was doing in between World War I and World War II to displace sterling. We need a different dispensation towards reform, one that does not get caught up in these issues, where the issue of international moneyness and international monetary functioning becomes a terrain of cooperation and multilaterality and not one of rivalry and antagonism. We'd be doing world trade and civilization a great deal of service if we go if we do that.
Yeah, I'll add one thing here, Paulo. This is what I think the IMF and the BIS are trying to do now, and this is why they're so involved in this conversation with central bank digital currencies. It's interesting.
Okay, great. The next question comes from Giovanni Caporioni. And the question is, if money is not a commodity, what about the entire logic of Capital Volume 1, Chapter 3?
I'm very relaxed about that. Look, Marx was looking at a system that was anchored on metallic monetary forms. So his analysis is going to show that. I think that the value forms discussions, if we understand them as involving the duality of exchange value and use value and the differences between buying and selling, then ultimately what we need are two things in the money thing. We need its value to be stable, and we need a social convention to sustain it. Marx implicitly left the value of the monetary commodity as the thing that sustains its value, as the value of the money thing or the money convention, but that doesn't need to be the case. Contemporary systems are not anchored on commodities, but we found a way to manage them with crises, with instability, that is anchored on management of its value, defined in relation to a basket of commodities. So again, like I said, I would rather say, hey, we win as a result of that observation than to worry a bit too much with things that may have pertained more to the particularity of the time and place into which Marx is intervening than with the potential broader significance of the point he was trying to make.
Okay, a third question is from Joao, and he says, Professor Paulo, congrats on your clear and brilliant explanation. I'm curious about what would be Marxist political economy take about the public franchise agreement that is currently responsible for undertaking credit extension in our economy. Is it fair to leave financial institutions alone in the stand restriction credit extension to pure economic reasons? What kind of arrangement could be put in place in order to manage money's elasticity in ways that favor the society in a broader way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a big question. I mean, what it's referring to is the fact that states operate licensing systems that enable certain agents to engage in money banking, in the creation of monetary forms based on deposit taking, but on the ex nihilo creation of monetary units convertible on their balance sheets. There is an implicit, and in some places explicit, element in that arrangement in that banks are regulated. And of course, the quality and the strength of that regulation, they all vary widely over time. I think that in the post early 1970s liberalization world, we've kind of lost sight of the variety of ways in which states can actually regulate banks. Even the words that we use have a certain anti-regulation bias. We talk about financial repression. When we talk about things that in the 1950s and 60s were pretty ordinary, like interest rate controls, or like mandatory service requirements, i.e., there are bounds within which interest rates must be, and banks, if granted a license, have certain requirements of servicing certain areas of the economy. Right? These things have become very unpopular, but those are things that have been done in the past. In today's discussions, I think that proposals around public banks and mandate charter banks that operate on the basis of charters, obliging them to pursue certain actions are interesting discussions along these lines. But ultimately, there's an interesting question that relates to some of what Hanina is pointing to, which is this, that maybe there is something that can be gained that is now technologically possible that may reduce some of the problems associated with a delegation of the functioning of the commercial banking system to private actors. And that is, if we can separate the operation of the payment systems from the operation of financial intermediation per se. These two have been bundled in conventional commercial banking because the technology of payments, which included communications and so on, was completely bound up with the branch networks of banks. And banks have been writing that joint business model for 300 years, 200-300 years. If payment systems migrate to what you would what you call narrow banks that are actually just operating, fully backed payments on online platforms, and then open up the commercial banks to offer different kinds of products to mobilize some of that could actually force banks to be, one, a little bit more generous towards the general current account holder, but could also separate these two things out in interesting ways. And I know every time I say this, I feel a little bit like a crank getting up, oh, what we need is narrow banking. But there are ways in which the new technologies allow us to rethink the boundaries between what are two distinct sets of services that we've just delegated to the same kinds of agents.
Okay, great. The next question comes from Patrick Rose, who says, can you discuss Keynes's writing on need for a global currency as necessary to stabilize capitalism? What international monetary regulation could meet Keynes's concern? What is the role of national and international bank regulation to stabilize monetary systems?
Well, that's huge. That's a huge question, and it could be a whole look. Okay, I think Keynes was complicated. Okay, Keynes was British, and what do I mean by that? A lot of what happens in the design of monetary systems, credit systems, and monetary policy pans out the way it does out of a conjugation of who has power and who hasn't power, who doesn't have power, and who is a creditor and who is a debtor. Keynes was representing a nation that was a debtor that no longer had any power, and that put him in a very peculiar position to articulate for the first time in a pretty comprehensive manner the possibility of running the international monetary system in a way that would not automatically be disadvantageous to deficit economies. And because he was Keynes and British, that argument got a lot more of a hearing than arguments of that kind have ever gotten. He was trying to run the system, first of all, run international monetary relations in a systematic fashion. What does that mean? It means the creation of an institution that would actually be charged with operating the functions of international money, and by virtue of that would be in a position to address persistent imbalances in a systemic fashion that reflects the fact that any persistent minus or deficit is as destabilizing as any persistent plus or a surplus. That stability requires a joined up approach to the process of trade development, but ultimately development of productivity. If world trade is not going to be a terrain for fleecing, for immiseration, and for recurring instability. I think that was right. Of course, Keynes is trying to intervene, like Marx, into the world that he was in. That's sensible. So he was looking at a world where there would not be a great deal of capital flows, and a world where there would be, at least over some time periods, fixed exchange rates. Okay, we can talk about ways in which to adapt that to today's world. But fundamentally, what he was trying to do, and I think that this is the key innovation, the key thing to think about, is he was trying to think of a system that would decouple international monetary functioning from domestic monetary functioning. And he understood in relation to this question of the recessionary biases of conventional resolution mechanisms, that separation could increase the policy space available to all participants in the system. And I think that that's a fundamental lesson. And that's important for a variety of reasons. Today, in the discussions that have been initiated by the intervention of the Brazilian government, have gotten confused, as you would expect, between the reactions to the proposal, between the notion of a common currency versus the notion of a multilateral clearing system. And that's a very important distinction to make, because a common currency is, as the experience of the Eurozone has taught us in remarkably painful ways, is not a way to go. And part of the problem, of course, it is that the original people in the post-war period that sought to carry elements of Keynes's flag, and I'm thinking here about exorbitant privilege guy, Descartes d'Estaing, and of course of Robert Triffin, they went very quickly from their dissatisfaction with the dollar-centeredness of the Bretton Woods system to being pro-Euro. And that created an illusion between, in common debates and in the public's imagination, between calls for reform and pushes for common currencies. What we need, and this is the headline of an article that I'm working on, are uncommon currencies that separate international functioning from domestic monetary functioning in ways that allow us to approach the resolution of international imbalances in ways that are conscious and as equitable as possible, and that give all participants as much policy space to pursue macroeconomic and social outcomes for which they will be responsible with as much space as possible.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Am I allowed? Because time is running out and I've got a question to ask. Okay. If I understood right, let's go back to Marx and the international monetary thing, which is what concerns a lot of people. And to be precise, let's go back to Ricardo. So Ricardo says, we've got this money, which is gold, and it has got labor value, cost of production, whatever we're going to call it, and it's got quantity theory determining what it does domestically, and that's how the system works. When we go to the international arena, though, the law of value doesn't work, says Ricardo, right? It doesn't. We don't have that. We've got comparative advantage, but we've got the quantity theory. And because he's got the quantity theory globally, he's got the system that equilibrates, which is basically what Hume had said before him, but Ricardo makes it systematic. So he doesn't have the law of value, but he's got the quantity theory. So he can get equilibrium. And what he gets is basically a theory that today is purchasing power parity theory, so international monetarism, right? That's what he gets. And that's it. For theory, that's it, right? There's no better theory that we've got available to us for equilibrium at the global level. That's it. Now let's take Marx. Marx, with Ricardo, takes a money that has got value. Okay, he leaves room for money that doesn't have value, of course, but he does a lot of his analytics with money that has value. Then goes to the international system, says law of value doesn't work, but there is no quantity theory either, right? Unlike Ricardo, there's no quantity theory internationally. There's no quantity theory domestically, no quantity theory internationally. So is there equilibrium? Can there be equilibrium global? And if there isn't, what does that mean? How does the global system equilibrate? How do you get nations to exchange? And what dictates the levels at which they will exchange money and commodities and balance their accounts at? What a question to ask here. To me, this clearly depends on the type of money in use, and it has inbuilt crisis to it, right? I mean, the system will equilibrate through crisis. I can't see any other way through which it will do it. It will do it through periodic violent rebalancing. Does the modern form of money make for more crises or fewer crises? Does it make for more frequent crises or for fewer crises? Does the money evolution we witness, does this exacerbate tension? Is this shift away from the dollar towards this possible creation of other forms? Does this mean that the rebalancing will be more violent, less violent? What do you see ahead? Will that create greater stability? Will that create less stability? Will that, what do you think that would do?
There are several huge questions in that, Kostas, but all...
You've got 3 minutes,
But and all pretty central to all of this that we're talking about. I agree with you that, you see, the power of Ricardo is that he always gives you an equilibrium account. And he could step outside of equilibrium, but the Ricardians don't. And you end up with people saying nonsense. And Marx didn't give us an alternative equilibrium either. What we can do as we think our way towards that is, well, let's look at history, because obviously there is going to be an element of contingency. And we've had, a number of years of that. In Ricardo's story, in Ricardo's story, of course, comparative advantage becomes a key kind of consequence, as a pattern of a specialization and as a consequence of adjustment. Anwar Sheikh has his two papers offering a critique of that, not dwelling on the monetary aspects, but dwelling on an aspect that I think is important to our understanding of what the characteristic evolution is going to look like. And it's an evolution of disequilibrium resolved by recurring crises. Because the moment that you reject the quantity theory of money shaping price levels in ways that are conducive to stabilization, then actually what you have is patterns of trade that are anchored on absolute advantages that don't necessarily change. In fact, they tend to widen, leading to chronic balance of payments movements that are adverse to deficit economies that only get resolved through explosions, devaluations, and so on, only for the same problems to build up over and over again. What's most evocative about that, to my mind, is that all of a sudden you're describing a dynamic evolution that matches our experience of the dynamic evolution of countries with lower levels of labor productivity engaged in international exchange and finance. I think that's a big advantage of any theoretical approach. You're putting me on a tight political spot here with the final question. So the answer to the first question is probably no. Probably there's contingency. And the elements that are going to pin down our best guess as to the social content of outcomes in that contingent, historically specific evolution is going to be measures of mobility of capital or capital controls, measures of mobility of labor, levels of productive integration, and of course, the possibilities for productivity augmenting paths of accumulation across the participants in trade. And that's where we're going to be at. And obviously, imbalances are going to be resolved in ways that are going to have consequences for domestic settlements and for international relations. The final question, I think, is big. And poses a difficulty that I wrestle with. In proposing reform, are we saying that if you moderate these problems of international monetary functioning, is capitalism all of a sudden going to function better and not be crisis ridden? And if it can, but with difficulties, is that a political project and so on? Look, first of all, the dollar-centered system has imbalances of a different kind than the imbalances of the convertible dollar system and of the gold standard. And we're seeing them play out. One of the questions in the chat here already pointed to this issue of US authorities using the standing of the dollar as international reserves as a geopolitical tool. That raised eyebrows, to put it mildly, everywhere else, everywhere except in the United States, where nobody noticed that you were effectively confiscating $500 billion of Russian assets. I mean, never mind what Russia is going to make of that. Think of what Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and others, not to mention China, are going to make of that. These are destabilizing moves that are of the unilaterality of the system that are a great deal of concern. Other people have pointed, and I think this is important, that this imbalance in the system of supplying of reserves centered on the dollar creates pressures on the dollar system that are destabilizing. The Norwegian pension funds that ended up, sitting on a bunch of mortgage-backed securities did so because they were looking for dollar-denominated, quote-unquote, safe assets because of the standing of dollar-denominated safe assets in portfolio management, and they lost their shirts. That at the same time was a small part of the bigger story of rest of the world demand for certain assets supporting the creation of very unstable things in the United States. My sense is that a neo-Keynesian type international arrangement could actually create a situation where, at the very least, the terms of dealing with imbalance could be better known to national policymakers, and the actual risk that is faced by domestic policymakers, risks of destabilizing movements against their currencies, which can lead to domestic instability and so on, would be under such a system more closely associated with domestic policy developments for which they have responsibility than to contagion effects and other results of mismanagement in the dollar zone. That would reduce a particular kind of noise, a particular kind of instability. Now, will there be others? Probably yes, and probably things that we're not going to sit here and pick our noses and anticipate. But I think that at least in the ways that are not only being destabilizing for a lot of developing countries now, but rather expensive to them, we can certainly do better than that.
I see. Okay.
I could ask another question. It is true. So it's really up to you, Paulo. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so the following question is from Spencer Brown, and he's saying, how can accounting conventions clarify monetary debates? For example, the category of cash and cash equivalents on the balance sheets of large corporations and financial firms, which consist of diverse kinds of short-term debt instruments, disproportionately dominated in the US dollar. What is the precise moneyness of these dollar-dominated cash equivalents?
This is where I would have liked to have the Marx quote about now the money, the cry is everywhere, only money is, only gold is money, or, you know, look, there are both cyclical and secular evolutions in what is considered money. The cyclical are the most important ones, or the more interesting ones. 2008, for example, money market mutual funds. Now, everybody knew that technically liabilities of money market mutual funds are not convertible by law. And that means that these were not exactly, these are equity investments, not convertible investments. But people started to act towards them as if they were money. And this was by design. I mean, that was the whole shtick of the industry. And when the commercial paper market collapsed following the bankruptcy of Lehman, and while some of these guys broke the buck, and all of a sudden the fact that that was not money became evident to everybody. One of the things that has happened over the past 30 years that has become very important for banks as well is that liquidity management has, or behavior towards liquidity that was historically more prevalent in the United States has become more generalized. And the holding of US Treasury securities has become an integral part of liquidity management by a lot of banks. So they're not necessarily going to the discount window or the interbank market. They're just piling up treasuries, and when they need liquidity, they go and sell them. And that's an important change. So I guess the answer is to the question, what is the precise moneyness of these dollar-denominated cash equivalents? Well, it varies. It varies over time. If you look at money in the store of wealth space, or in that side of its existence, the thing that you are looking for is the unquestioned capacity to settle an obligation. If something gives you that capacity over some time horizon, it's liquid. If you have questions about it, then it doesn't give it to you. There's something, sorry, that I wanted to introduce quickly before, and in relation to the discussion about is crypto money. Just a kind of a rule of thumb, because, you know, moneyness is trust, right? I mean, it's even in the word, you know, credo, and then Kostas has the Greek version, belief. So there's an aspect of, just like with trust, if you're asking yourself whether you have it or not, you don't. And that's a pretty useful rule of thumb. We can understand, for example, and some of what the Fed has done over the past 10, 15 years, as Perry Merling put it, by moving to acting as a dealer of last resort to ensure liquidity in US Treasury markets. And it's very significant as part of a project that some of us can understand as hegemonic in trying to support confidence in the capacity of holdings of US Treasuries to provide moneyness liquidity services. But what that tells me is that these things are not given, that there's a hustle, that the manager has to be doing things to ensure that private agents still act towards it in that particular way. And that makes it, as with all things money, there's no resolution. There's just recognition of how fleeting and managed things are. And I think that's important in all of this.
Okay, I think it's time, right? So it's been a long evening here in London, long whatever afternoon in New York and elsewhere. I'd like to thank Paulo for a very wide-ranging talk, and thank both Hanin and Josephine for opening it up even more and touching upon all these highly relevant questions. You know, as Schumpeter said, the views of money are like the shifting clouds. You can't pin them down. And I don't expect that we would resolve. I never expected that would resolve the issue today. But I think we're the good step at laying out key questions. I think people would admit to that. I think it went well. I'd like to thank all participants and close the session by inviting you to the next one, about which you will receive notice pretty soon. Thank you.